and welcome to another episode of How We Love Now. We are really excited just because we have our very first guest speaker on the How We Love Now podcast, Vivian Zhang, joining us today. Vivian is a registered social worker and therapist in Ontario, Canada, and she has worked across some of Toronto's leading hospitals and universities, including CAMH, North York General, and the University of Toronto. And what's really unique about Vivian is that she not only brings a deep clinical expertise, but also her own lived experiences as a first generation immigrant, which gives her a unique perspective on the challenges of identity, achievement, and belonging in today's society. So, in this episode, we're diving deep into how culture and communication styles shape the way that we love, fight, connect in families and in our relationships. And it's a conversation that matters really deeply, I think, in today's society, especially for immigrant families, multicultural couples, and really anyone navigating questions of identity and belonging in their closest relationships as well. So, welcome to the show, Vivian.
Thank you so much for having me, Irmela and Kiana. Really
Of
appreciate it.
course. Well, we would love to start off by just sharing like your personal journey as a first generation immigrant and how this shaped the work as you do as a therapist.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that quick introduction and sharing a little bit more about me. So, I immigrated with my family quite young. We came here, and at that time, there was a lot of different kind of pressures. So, really kind of like coming here for career pieces and things like that. So, at that time when I immigrated, my parents actually immigrated at different times. So our family was actually scattered and separated for a few years.
It
And
must have
once
been really
we,
tough.
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's like I was gifted with just not being old enough to understand it, but you can definitely feel how it's different in terms of
Yeah.
when you have a specific parent around versus not. And it's
Hmm.
actually a really common experience that I also hear from a lot of clients where their families are kind of separated depending on where their parent is working. And
Hmm.
sometimes you're more likely to be raised by like grandparents
Yeah.
versus like sometimes you might be raised by like one parent for a period of time and then another, or parents are like separated for long periods of time because they're in different countries. So, yeah, lots of those really interesting, unique immigrant pieces in terms
Hmm.
of my experience. There were just different struggles being here as a whole family, and that led to some pretty high conflict at home at times. So that's also a piece of kind of the work that I do with a lot of different families and couples to really address how do we have good communication at all
Yeah.
different levels, right? Within sort of our family, within our coupling and our partnerships. And then also really think about what that looks like when you're communicating with your children as well.
And one thing I would love to just like touch note on that I definitely resonated when you said like sometimes when there's a parent that's absent, I do want to touch light on sometimes as we grow, right? Sometimes we crave that attention from that absentee parent. I would love for you to just like touch note on that a little bit if you can.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a lot of information out there right now, right, about how formative our younger years are in terms of
Yeah.
our attachment and the relationships that we have.
Yeah.
So when we sort of think about what that looks like for us too, if let's say during those very formative years, we don't feel like we have what we would call like a secure attachment with a family member or parent, it can feel really challenging. I think
Mhm.
for a lot of folks, when we're thinking about dating, they
Yeah.
are kind of searching for partners who may represent a bit more of that like absentee parent to kind of fill a bit of that craving. Or even when you're in partnership, right? Sort of the
Mhm.
ways that you're communicating can look quite different, that there are particular communication styles you might inherit from each of the parents. If there is a parent who is away, sometimes it can be very challenging to figure out then how do I communicate to someone because I
Mhm.
don't really have the opportunities to really develop some of those communication skills.
Yeah. I like the way you said that too because whenever you were stating that, it made me think of me personally. Like, my dad was always the one like working for the household, and my mom was primarily in the house taking care of the kids. And so now in my current relationships, I used to start off characteristics I saw in my dad and my partner. So I was just trying to make sure, like, yeah, that was pretty cool that you touched on that.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you too, Kiana. We definitely date our parents, or we go like the exact opposite and we date people
Yeah.
who are nothing like them. So I usually say, because I practice a little bit more from the dialectical side, so like a little bit of both, right? We want certain traits that are lovely within our parents that we want to carry forward, maybe
Hmm.
to, families, our own families that we may want to create someday or have created, right? As well as thinking about maybe some of those characteristics that we don't really want to inherit anymore and want to have out the window and create something new and different.
Absolutely. So my other question is, how do you see culture influencing the way people express emotions and communicate in relationships?
Yeah, so I was really thinking about this piece too from the conversation I was having with Arella. And in terms of thinking about that cultural piece, culture gives us context, right? Each of us
Mm,
have our own histories. And when we sort of think about what that looks like in relationships and communication, is that our culture almost gives us that context and subtext in how we're communicating. So, an example of that would look like, in my family, you would never receive an I love you or an apology. That's
mhm.
just not clearly communicated. But you knew that you were loved because you were clothed, you had, a warm bed to kind of go into at the end of the night. You also knew you were loved because my mom would come into the room with like a plate of fruit, right? Have you eaten yet? Are you feeling okay? Stuff like that. So there were certain ways that they tended to and cared for us and
Yeah.
understood, how to do that, right? So there's like those kind of, I would say, very common cultural pieces. Because
Mhm.
when I sort of think about my other friends who don't really understand this, like when, their parents are kind of like, here's $15, go buy yourself something, or I love you so much, I can't wait to see you later, honey, right? Or like, let me pack all of these things for you. It's just so different, right? We have our parents who will also treat us quite differently, and that's how we experience and probably first understand how to communicate and express love.
I just want to say I can totally relate to the plate of fruit. For some reason, that is
Yeah.
like a universal apology for all immigrant parents. You're in a fight, and then all of a sudden, nothing gets talked about, but they bring you food. And I can also relate to the piece that I never heard my parents say I love you until we moved to Canada. And then I heard all of these children and saw how children here were communicating with their parents. And I was shocked. And I remember going to my dad saying, "Hey, how come you never tell me that you love me? Like, what does this
Mhm.
actually mean about our relationship?" So then he started this joke where he only says, "I love you" on our birthdays. Otherwise, it's just like a begrudgingly, yeah, me too.
Yeah, I usually say in our family, we pay the immigrant tax where either to like hide from high conflict situations and don't
Mm.
express anything, or you get trained over time to just like understand the subtext, right? If there's fruit, you're loved. We don't say it. It's not something that we ever talk about, but you just
Yeah.
know. So how that translates for a lot of couples is there's one person who's like, providing the fruit or asking if they've eaten, and the other person just like, this person never tells me that they love me, right? So you
Mm.
still experience that cultural difference for a lot of couples these days.
And I can see how that would lead to a lot of conflict in couples if the scripts are so different, if the love languages are so different.
Yeah.
And even though your partner might be trying their best to show you that they care, to show you that they love you might not necessarily feel it because the cultural script is so different.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to think of what are some ways we can give advice to couples who are navigating that season, but they may not always know the context of their partner cultural struggles, if that makes sense. Because I will say new couples, right? They don't have the knowledge of knowing, I know their families and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think about this as that we have a lot of different layers to things, right?
Yeah.
Like as humans, we're actually quite complex. So we
Mm-hmm.
actually share a wealth of very similar experiences. But in partnership, I think the main key is really going back to what I would consider like the three C's. Do you have compassion? Do you have curiosity? And do you have communication or clarity? Right? So making sure that we're always assessing for these pieces, not just in our partner, but also in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I think, just to share a little bit about myself, my partner and I are not from the same culture, but we share a lot of those common immigrant experiences, the expectations from our parents, sort of what it
Right.
looked like at home in terms of communication, what conflict resolution might have looked like. And having those experiences helped build the foundation of our relationship. We had a mutual understanding there. But there's obviously nuances that come with it too, where, I'm trying to feed him and he's like, stop doing that. It makes me feel bad. Right. So it's like, it's really interesting how that's experienced and expressed. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a big part of it is, can we then really just go back? Sometimes even turn a little bit more inward, have that reflection, understand what it is that we need in terms of love being expressed and how we express it. And then also like ask our partner about it, right? Whether it's new relationships or relationships that have been there for decades, I think it's still really important to ask about those nuances
Mm-hmm.
and get the context.
That makes so much sense. Thank you so much for clarifying. So I would love to know, you're known for using metaphors and analogies in your therapy. What draws you to that style and how does it help your clients?
Yeah, in terms of the metaphors and analogies, I feel like it's just the way my brain thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it really easy to kind of think in that way, especially because we're talking about some really complex concepts.
Yeah.
When you're saying, hey, communication, what makes good communication? And you say stuff like, well, probably clarity or like being very, like, being able to express your needs. As a concept, I think we all kind of get it. But in
Yeah.
practice, it's hard to understand it until we have an example. So a lot of times I tell couples, like, how when you're listening to music, there's this version where you hear the music, and then there's this version where you hear the lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the music and the lyrics just don't match.
Yeah.
So, our job when we're communicating is, one part, do we understand how to match up our own music and lyrics? As well as, can we start to listen for what our partner's music and lyrics are like, and whether there's
Mm-hmm.
a bit of that discrepancy? Right. I'm just thinking a very common issue that comes up with a lot of heterosexual couples is usually like if, you know, a partner, a male partner asks their female partner, do you want something to eat? And she's like, no, I'm okay.
I think everyone can relate to that.
Right? Like, are we listening to the music here? He might go, okay, she just said she's fine. She doesn't really want food.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But
Mm-hmm.
if we're listening to a bit of that music and we start to have that curiosity and understanding what the I'm okay is
Mm-hmm.
about, we might actually hear, no, I'm actually really hungry, but I don't really want to force you to buy
Right.
me something that, you don't want to get me. I also wanted to feel taken care of. If you could just do that automatically, I would love it so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We don't hear that. But that's what's helpful in communication. It's not just about what I'm sharing, trying to get you to understand as well, but also like, do you get what I'm sharing?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think that's a huge piece that I talk a lot about with couples when we think about the music and the lyrics.
And definitely, oh, sorry, I was gonna say, definitely just picking up on those cues, right, with your partner. Because oftentimes we do say, our partner will ask us, hey, are you good? And we typically say, yeah, I'm fine, but we know we're not fine. So, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
just making sure the music match up with the lyrics. And when you know it's not, probe a little bit more.
Exactly.
We're terrible at probing sometimes. We really do take things at face value. I think that's what I notice with most of my couples is how much
Yeah.
of what is said is being taken at face value versus
Hmm.
trying to peel back a little bit of like the layers too. And that actually brings me to the next point that I would love for us to talk a bit more about, which is different communication styles when we are in conflict. So in some families, like harmony and this respect for authority is really prioritized, and I see this a lot in more collectivist societies. Whereas for others, the direct expression of how we're feeling and what we're thinking, that is the method in which we communicate. And again, not to overgeneralize, but this tends to be more the tendency in individualistic society. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more on how these differences show up in conflict with couples and families, and what are some ways of communicating more effectively so we can hear each other better and understand each other better while also acknowledging these fundamental differences.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And also thinking about it within the context of even like an immigrant family,
Yeah.
right? Because what you maybe come with, I see immigrant families as like this very interesting time capsule. You might bring a specific culture with you to a new culture and raise your children in that new culture. So, a lot of times, that conflict within families we actually see as the difference in terms of how they're communicating, right? The way they speak to, children might speak to each other in the school setting could look very different than how parents expect children to speak to them at home, because you have those differences already, and also how that then later is passed on into partnerships. These children might speak to their partners in a different way, and you might even have like the same immigrant experience, right? I have couples who, like, depending on when they've immigrated, they're the same culture, they're both immigrants. One might have come when they were much younger, like myself. The other might have come further along in elementary school or even high school, sometimes being an international student.
Yeah.
And they actually carry very different historical context with them.
Mhm.
So as much as like on paper it looks the same, their communication actually looks quite different as well. We also want to remember that there's language involved, and as much
Mhm.
as today and everything that we're discussing is in English, how English is used is quite different too. When I go back and I speak Chinese, the Chinese that I have is like from when we immigrated. All these new words that are being added on aren't within my own vocabulary. So if I'm speaking to someone, even within the new generation, like my cousins, there's a difference there too in terms of how we communicate and what that communication looks
Exactly.
like.
And I think it's almost worse when you are within the same culture sometimes, but there is this difference in terms of when you actually immigrated, because
Mhm.
at least in couples from two different cultures, there's more of that understanding that there's going to be some differences and we need to talk about these differences and we need to do something about it. So it's more openly talked about versus with a couple from the same culture where the immigration experience can be very different, and yet the expectation is that we're going to be the same, because then the
Yeah.
interpretation is that there's something wrong with us as a couple because we should be matching up with all of these things. We should be agreeing. We should see the world in the same way, but we
Mhm.
don't.
Yeah, you make a really good point, Arilla. And that's where I really kind of go back. Like, I'm like, I love the three C's, right? If we can be compassionate, if we can be curious, and we can clarify around our communication, I think that's sort of the foundation and basis in terms of how we can have good partnership and
Yeah.
how we can have good communication or conflict resolution in our families as well. Right? Just don't assume what's happening. I think the saying that I kind of remember, like when my elementary teacher was teaching us about the word assume, she's
Mhm.
like, okay, kids, listen to this one. Don't assume, because you're making an ass out of who? You and me. Because when you're spelling it out, right? ASSUME. So,
I
yeah.
love
So
that
it's
saying as
like,
well.
yeah. We're just like, oh, these are the things I remember, right? So,
And I will say, I have personally seen resentment factors among families when there is someone who came from the States. I mean, came from, as an immigrant, came over to the States, and they also had like a sibling that was born in the States. There's always a disconnect there. I've always seen within the household, which is always just coming from a place of understanding, too, I think is important, because not everyone's experiences are different, but we're all within the same family. So,
Absolutely. I really like the three C's, and I think I will repeat that to myself over and over in my next conversation with my partner. I do want to talk a little bit about something a bit more serious. Let's talk a bit about intergenerational trauma or cultural silence. I think in a lot of immigrant families, the way in which they've immigrated, the reasons for which they've immigrated is tied to a lot of trauma. There was something very traumatic back home. The immigration process in and of itself can be quite traumatic. And I think for the sake of resilience, sometimes we don't have enough time to actually process those emotions. So I think because of that, the families start to rely on silence, start to rely on this idea that we don't talk about emotions because we don't know how to talk about our emotions, or it's not the right time to talk about the emotions because we're still in that survival state. I wonder if you can speak a bit to how this impacts communication within families from your work.
Yeah, I was thinking about this piece too in terms of just one part, the historical context for a lot of families and what that looks like, and also how we're now in a generation where we are a lot more open to sharing around some of these things that used to be kept silent,
Hmm.
right? So it's a part of it, I think, is recognizing that for parents or older generations, it is hard for them to imagine some of the things that maybe this generation and younger generations will understand very implicitly, right? The way we get information is different now, how we consume and think about information is different. And also being able to be in an environment that, although there are still a lot of political unrest, I think it makes a lot of sense that we are more moving out of survival into being able to thrive, right?
Yeah.
Because when I think about my grandparents, like my parents got great education from their parents, which is stay quiet, don't make a sound because we're going through two world wars, right? Like this is education that you kind of get. You have to be able to survive, stay quiet, be small, keep to yourself, because those were good survival tactics then.
Yeah.
Versus once they come here to a country where you don't have to survive in the same way, you're dealing with other challenges, those same pieces don't work anymore.
Yeah.
I kind of think about it from like an internal family systems approach too. Like these parts of us are helpful at some point, just not in the current context.
I think sometimes we don't know how to switch
Hmm.
off those danger signals. I think for some of us who have gone through a lot of trauma, it's really hard to move from survival to thriving. We're scared to let go of what that survival mode brings to us, which is that sense of safety. It's hard to regain that sense of safety.
And it also makes you wonder, even as society, when will we become more balanced, right? Because on the other hand, we're no longer in that flight or flight mode, right? But there's so much accessibility in the world, right? That you can come across secondhand trauma, firsthand trauma. It's a lot that we have to think about, right? So I always wonder when will we ever find that balance as a society?
Yeah. Kiana, to your point too, when I think about finding that balance, a piece of that balance is in our own internal work. So usually when I
Yeah.
think about it, it's like the more healing I'm able to do, the more I can provide that in the work that I do with clients, right? When
Hmm.
I don't know a piece of that healing, I'll just say it, but
Right.
also recognizing that like this is also an exploration we're probably doing together. So that twofold of one part
Hmm.
doing that exploration for yourself and then the other part doing it for the bigger community.
Hmm. I like that. Right. So, what are some common communication breakdowns you see in couples therapy that may be influenced in culture?
So, in terms of some of those communication breakdowns, one part of that communication breakdown is likely going to be the directness in terms of how people communicate. So, really kind of thinking about, like, just to say, in Chinese culture, right? When you have these differences in terms of your older generation to younger generation, there are different almost rules of engagement where you need to be respectful. And so, for a lot of different couples, if let's say that family follows this certain line of respect, it can create a lot of concerns in the family itself, for the couple, or for the partner integrating into that family, or even like as children, learning how to have your own thoughts alongside that, policy of engagement to be able to hold that respect. Another piece too is really thinking about having the language to share some of these things that we need and we're feeling. When I sort of think back to telling my mom that, hey, I'm gonna go do my master's of social work, she was like, what's a social worker? Because at that time, there really wasn't an equivalent in Chinese society to really say this is kind of what it looks like to study something like this. And also everything here, although they've experienced university in Canada also looks very different to university in China. They followed a nice tight cohort for their degrees, versus here it's like sink or swim, good luck to you. So it's just so different when we kind of think about those different contexts. The other piece in terms of communication is sort of what I was talking about too, about that context underneath, sort of that subtext and how we're speaking. That sometimes there's those cultural differences in terms of how we apologize, how we might repair if there is something that's hurtful that has been said. I've heard different situations where one partner might say something and the other partner would take that as a criticism and say, that really hurt me. I really didn't like when you use that language. And the partner would say, well, I'm doing it for your good. You need to hear this. Right? Because there are certain families that operate in that way where some version of, let's just call it feedback or criticism, is actually seen as a form of care.
I can definitely relate to that because Albanians are the most brutally, and I mean brutally, honest people. But we have the saying even in the culture, which is you have to be, because if you don't care about the other person. Whereas I think in North American society, it comes across as really rude, even though it's meant to be like a sign of love, a sign of care, and wanting the best for the other person.
Yeah. And I like how you guys both said that, because I will say my husband's family, they all came from Haiti. And so now they're all in the States, and as he's growing up, they pushed that he needs to be a doctor, he needs to be a lawyer, right? And he never migrated to any of those industries, but they also, in a sense, they don't say he's a failure, but they kind of hint like you should have gravitated to one of those industries. So it's kind of like, I like how you said they still form it in a way of caring. Like, we want nothing but the best for you because we know how hard it was for us. So understanding that our parents mean well, right? They just, it's a language, piece.
Sometimes it's not phrased in a way that feels the best.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's like the immigrant trio: engineering, doctor, or lawyer, and anything else you're seen as a failure.
Yeah. Whereas, like, if you are born in the States, you have more freedom, like less judgment, So
Yeah.
And I think both of you are also really speaking to then what is the kind of language we're used to communicating in as well.
Yeah.
Right? Like really thinking about, okay, that kind of directness maybe is normal in the society that our parents grew up in, or our partner's parents grew up in. However, in our society, we have a different way of engaging.
Yeah.
So that plays into the language and the communication in terms of how we engage, right? So when I think about respect, there's a certain way I have to learn to switch off some of the things I actually want to say that are actually quite direct and Western, versus in certain situations with like elder, generations, I really have to think about the wording.
Yeah.
And there's always like a double entendre. There's always subtext. Because in Chinese, as a language, there are these parables. So you have like 4 characters to 8 characters. It's a sentence, but it has a whole background story to it. And it explains exactly what a moment should feel like, right? Yeah. We don't have that in the English language. English language is very binary. So one part is also like the exact language, plus the history, plus your own immigrant experience. That all adds different layers in terms of how we communicate with our partners and communicate in families.
Absolutely. And I would say even the standards are different. Like, for example, like some in different cultures where graduating high school is a big milestone, some graduating high school for another culture is minimum. So it's almost like, I think that's a big thing to navigate too.
Yeah, definitely the expectations.
Yeah. But can you share examples of when cultural values like saving face, collectivism, or independence clash in relationships?
Definitely. I think one example that I'm sort of thinking of is for couples outside of their partnership, they usually want to make sure that they have people they can confide in, building their own strong supports. However, in certain cultures, when you're thinking about saving face, not bringing kind of shame to your own family, it creates a lot of that insular silence. Or in partnerships where one partner feels more comfortable sharing, but the other isn't, and this
Mhm.
isn't just cultural, I would say,
Right.
right? Then you have different expectations around how communication happens and how you can form connections. And so, if I think more specifically from a cultural lens, in my culture, our family narrative is don't air out your dirty laundry in somebody else's yard, right? You can have the dirty laundry, talk about it at home, we'll talk about it, we'll talk through it, but nobody else should know what that looks like. Right? When
Mm,
you're on the outside, you are representing your family. So if you do anything that is not seen as appropriate for the family image, then you're probably going to get a very big talking to once you get home,
mhm.
right? Which was really interesting, kind of confusing as a child, because you get this version of like, okay, outside we look so perfect and we do all of these
Right.
things and we're like smiling and nobody really thinks there's issues in your family. But then you come home and it's like World War III, like things are blowing up, right? It's almost like it feels like a personal, almost like gaslighting of should I be feeling this way? Can I be feeling that way? A lot of those internal doubts, which I do see for individuals when they come into therapy, as well as like seeing how that shows up in
Mhm.
relationships later on too. Because if we don't have our own strong foundation, then what are we building our relationships on?
Absolutely.
And I think the sense of hypervigilance too, that even if things seem okay on the outside, you can never trust that there isn't something bad that's going to come as soon as you get home. So I think
Yeah.
it also trains people as individuals to always be on the lookout for the next conflict as well.
Yeah, I see that a lot in partnerships too, right? Like it's nice, it's calm, and then for some reason one partner's like, I don't understand why they're always trying to pick a fight with me. And you're like, well, their nervous system is a little wired for that chaos. And then how then do the two of you start to develop a language that makes sense between you two? The way I also sort of think about it back to the whole analogies thing is you might learn the same language, but if we think about like Quebecois French versus like Parisian French, it's technically the same language, technically, but I would say sometimes, or I'm told a lot that like it's not the same. It sounds actually really different, right? So when you're in partnership, then how do you communicate even though technically you're using the same language?
Mhm. So, in that same token, from your perspective, how can therapy, CBT, EFT, DBT, mindfulness help couples and families build more effective ways of connecting?
I would say at the foundation of therapy when we're practicing it is to build a more of that self-awareness, right?
Hmm.
If we don't really know about ourselves, then how do we communicate that to somebody else? Someone who might just be getting frustrated about a situation, if you don't understand the root of your own frustration or even how you experience frustration, it will just be projected and come out.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of times, regardless of what the modality is, usually when clients come in, they're like telling me all about, yeah, I want to do CBT and I want to do, I'm like, that's great. I think all of the modalities are extremely important. However, really want to think about how we holistically look at the picture, right? Because you're not just your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They're a part of you, as well as how then do you start to examine your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors using these different modalities and building those different skills, right? Because likely you're going to be put in a situation where if we just say, this is the way this works, it's going to feel like it's linear, but it's not. Like
Hmm.
life as an image, I love seeing this on Instagram, but people assume life is sort of this linear line versus in real life, life is kind of like all scribbly all over the place. Where is the finish line? Who knows?
Right.
Right. So I think it's
But
really,
Vivian, we love the linear line. We don't want
we
the
do.
scribbles.
Yeah. I think the linear line feels comfortable because we can predict it.
Yeah.
But the reality is there's multiple small linear lines within your scribbles. Are you able to then dissect that picture to look for the smaller pieces too?
Lately, I've been thinking a lot, especially because I'm trying to do more work within my community. That is one
Hmm.
area that I'm trying to develop a bit more. So I've been thinking a lot about how can we adapt some of these treatment modalities so they are a bit more culturally sensitive. And some treatment modalities are a better fit for certain cultures than others. And what I'm finding is that there's always tweaks that need to be made to the modalities that are more culturally specific. I'm wondering if you have any advice for the therapists that might be listening in terms of how can we adapt some of these treatments and the way that we deliver them to be more culturally sensitive.
That's a great question. Part of that being culturally sensitive is really thinking about this model of if I don't understand, will I ask? I think sometimes what I generally see when I'm providing supervision is a lot of therapists feel the pressure of like, oh, I'm in this expert seat. Now I have to know all these things, right?
Hmm.
No, at the end of the day, you're building a collaborative relationship. So if you don't know it, you don't know it. And the reality is, every single relationship, we're going to have what we call ruptures. It's not so much the mistake that we make, but more so how do we repair that mistake? That's super important. And I think that's the piece that, as we sort of talk about this cultural lens, if you don't know it, are there ways that you're asking? Are there ways that you're trying to engage in it? Because at the end of the day, even though I know my culture, I only have a speck or a lens of what my experience is like in that culture.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to know what it feels like, particularly for any other client or any other person. And if I make that assumption, then I'm actually really robbing us of some really rich experiences of getting to explore that together.
And I find sometimes approaching it with a beginner's mindset when you don't know about a culture can be more effective. Because I find in my therapy with clients who are from my cultural backgrounds, I notice that I make a lot more assumptions about the dynamic and what's going on versus if I'm working with clients from like a different cultural background where I would ask more of those questions. And I think sometimes we have this idea that in order to work effectively with the client, we need to be from that culture. And sometimes that is really helpful. I know a lot of clients feel more comfortable when someone sort of gets a cultural background. And in some cases, there might be some more assumptions that are being made in that context as well. Some which may be accurate, some which might not be as accurate as well.
Yeah, completely. So it's always holding both in mind, right? How can we be curious and use the knowledge that we have? And although we have that knowledge, do we check that knowledge with the client?
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move a bit from trying to understand to more what we can do in these contexts. Let's start with couples. What is one practice, one practical thing that couples can try if they feel stuck in this cultural communication differences?
Especially if couples are feeling stuck, I would say first and foremost, I like to have the practice of being able to take a bit of a step back.
Hmm.
Can you start to figure out your own stories and what's being added as like that subtext to the conversation? Right. The other piece is still going back to the three C's. I think I'm describing the three C's multiple times. This
Very important.
Right.
they're important. They're sort of like my foundation for things, right? Because it helps us really get that clarity. We can't communicate what we don't know. So
Hmm.
we have to get to know it. And we need to be compassionate, not just like with our partner, but also with ourselves.
What do the three C's look in practice? Like, if you and I were having a fight over the dishes, it was my turn to do them and I didn't do it. How can you approach me if you're abiding by the three C's?
Yeah. So what it looks like in the background is if I think you should be doing dishes and you haven't, right? Compassion would look like, okay, do I understand why Arvilla didn't do the dishes? Am I making an assumption that Arella knew I wanted the dishes done before dinner, before we eat, and that's what's happening? And then I'm going to be curious. I'm going to say, Arella, I think we said we wanted the dishes done before we started dinner. The dishes aren't done. Can you tell me what was maybe happening at that time? And then that's how we clarify and we continue to have those curious questions to help us bring more clarity to the situation.
Mhm.
And I can see in that context how so many couples would make the assumption it's because they're never listened to me. It's because they don't care. It's because they expect me to do it. And I think some of these scripts could go back to the way that we've been raised and the patterns that we've seen modeled to us through our families and the communication, the way that our parents made assumptions for one another as well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of that plays into the conversation as well, right? The way I sort of almost like imagine it visually is that two couples are having that conversation in the moment, but in the background is all of this history, right? The way their parents had those conversations or resolved conflict, the way they might have been socialized in the community that they were socialized in growing up. Because if you immigrated, that socialization looks so different
Yeah.
than, your cousins or other family members who maybe never immigrated, right? And all of that is coming into play within that singular moment. So it can be pretty intense and it can be a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. There's always so much happening in the background. I think 5% is just what's happening in the moment, but most of it is all of this history and background, which is why couples therapy can be challenging at times. And how about for families? So, especially for families who are struggling with the unspoken or silenced emotions, what is a gentle first step to open the conversation in a way that also follows the cultural script or like the cultural expectations?
I think for families, I would say for the person who's recognizing what's happening, unfortunately, you're paying the, tax of taking on that generational knowledge and also that you have the awareness to start building an understanding for yourself. And I think that's where we see a lot of folks in this generation starting therapy. Where
Mhm.
can I start to break that lineage? Where can I put away that inheritance? Because it probably wasn't safe to put away before. So I think for families, one part is if the family structure allows for more of that curiosity and listening, I think that's a wonderful place to kind of set family meetings where we just say, okay, we're going to practice this idea of like listening to each other. And even if someone says something really harsh, we're not going to adjust it. We're just going to try and listen.
Yeah.
There could be a practice in families for that. Or if, let's say, there are families who maybe hold on to a more rigid communication structure, can you start with yourself to build that into your communication as you talk to your family? I usually like to say that it took me about 6 years to train my mom to say, I love you. And now when I get off the phone and I don't say it, she goes, you have to say the thing you're supposed to say. And
Art.
I was like, okay, I love you. She goes, me too, me too, me too. Right? It's like watching almost like that childlike version of her that never received it
Mm,
be able to finally experience it, right? Because I think in our minds, we're like, with our parents, we think of it as almost like that linear process of they should know because they're older.
mhm.
But what we forget is they're also living for the first time. And if they never received it, how would they ever know to give it?
Mm,
And so we kind of
that's
learn
beautiful.
all of those pieces as we go.
And I think it's a very compassionate way of interpreting our parents' behaviors as well. Because I think sometimes when you are in the thick of it, when you are in the conflict of it, it's really easy to become very resentful, to become very angry. And I think underneath that resentment and anger, there's a lot of pain. But
Yeah.
once we're caught up in the emotions of it, it's really easy to not see the other side. The same way that we're trying the best that we can, they're also trying the best that they can as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly.
And it also brings me back to the point of like, and a great reminder for parents and our partners, like outside of those roles, they're humans at the end of the day. So having those three C's impact really sheds light.
We're loving the three C's.
Right.
It's just so much easier to remember, right?
They really are. I'm going to teach them to my partner right after this. So, Vivian, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a very interesting discussion on how culture shapes communication, on how there can be a lot of miscommunication because of these different cultural scripts, and also what are some practical things that we can do with our families, with our partners to close a bit of that gap as well. For the listeners who want to know more about you, share a bit about how they can contact you on social media, different platforms.
Yeah, definitely. You can follow me at vivian.therapy on Instagram, or I also operate out of Inner Room, a private practice, a virtual practice that serves all different clients across Ontario. And you can follow us there at inner.room.on. And also, if you wanted to connect with us via email, you're more than welcome to take a look at our website at innerroom.ca.
I think our clients are very lucky to have you. And thank you for sharing all your wisdom today with us.
Very insightful.
Thank you both.